um, arising out of some of the questions that were raised either in discussion or then perhaps directly to me from last week. I want to talk a little bit more about St. Augustine and the problem of sin. And I'm going to basically be sharing with you a reading, not from me for once, what do you know, but from one of my favorite theologians over the decades, a woman by the name of Marjorie Hewitt Suhaki. And this book is called The Fall to Violence. Marjorie now is retired, living in Texas, I believe, but still with us. But I really love this book, The Fall to Violence. The subtitle is Original Sin in Relational Theology. Early in her book, she's discussing St. Augustine a little bit. So let me read and make some comments. I don't think this will take too long. As with so many doctrines, the doctrine of sin has its formative expression in the work of Augustine, who drew upon the biblical understanding of his day, the accumulated theological wisdom of the early church, and of course upon his philosophical and cultural heritage. His fundamental teaching on sin might be best captured in his phrase, "All evil is the result of sin and its punishment." This is a quotation from Augustine's book On True Religion. And then she tells us that what she's about to talk about is a summary from stuff in his book, The City of God, on the freedom of the will, on the deserving of sinners and their forgiveness, and on rebuke and grace, various works of St. Augustine. I've only read Confessions in the City of God, which is, I say only, but that's a big chunk of work. So, back to Suhaki. He developed his understanding of the basis of sin through a mythic structure that powerfully captured his insight into the human condition. Perhaps borrowing from earlier Gnostic and apocalyptic myths, as well as his own Manichaean past. Hopefully you know a little bit about now his time as what was called then an auditor in the Manichaean sect. Augustine rooted sin not simply in human rebellion against God, but in a heavenly conflict prior to the creation of earth. This would be important partly because in trying to account for why there is sin and evil in the world, well, we can blame human beings. We certainly can. But what if we assume that human beings were essentially perfect in creation? How in the world did they ever screw up so badly? Right? Sometimes we hear people talk about, well, creation was perfect in the beginning. And a lot of people say things like that I don't think they should say, that I don't think the Bible really supports. But John Wesley was certainly guilty of this. And Wesley could go on and on about the perfections of Adam, by which I assume he means Adam and Eve, but he just basically talks about Adam all the time. And after a while you kind of go, wow, if he was so perfect, how in the world did he or they, humanity, ever sin? Well, you might want to blame it on the devil, but it seems like you're just pushing the problem back one step, right? Because Satan is also part of creation. And if you go with the notion a perfect God necessitates a perfect creation, you haven't really solved anything by appealing to Satan, who is assumed to be an angelic being created by God. All right? So, back now to Suhaki. Augustine rooted sin not simply in human rebellion against God, but in a heavenly conflict prior to the creation of earth. Angelic beings, created for the purpose of praising God and enjoying the bliss of such praise forever, turned from their necessarily total dependence upon God to rely on their own created capacities instead. again, we should note the legitimate question would be, well, why? How? How would this be possible? While such a story is simple, back to Huhaki, it contains profound depths. First, the praise of God is bliss, is, great happiness, because through praise the beings are actively and positively participating in the divine being that is their very source of life. To praise God is in some sense to know God, but to know God is to know and be connected to the source of one's being, and therefore one's bliss. Thus, the praise rendered to God in the story is not to be interpreted as some sort of flattery needed by the divine ego. I think that's always an important thing to remember. To the contrary, it conveys the very graciousness and generosity of God as the sustainer of creation. The projected angelic turning, the projected, meaning like Augustine's projecting his imagination into this situation, this projected angelic turning from dependence upon God, then, is a turning not only from the source of bliss, but from the sustenance of being. Thus these angels fall. But where is there to fall? Where are they going to fall to? There is a hint within the Christian myth of the Gnostic and pagan versions that relate the creation of the visible universe to the consequences of the fall. Now, that's not official Christian teaching, of course, although it appears to have been what Origen believed to be the case, and this is another one of the problems with Origen. God is invisible, immortal. The world in which we live is visible and most mortal. Its distance from God, then, is like the distance of the fall. All right, so again, the idea would be possibly that the material creation itself was undertaken by God, we could say, as a place for creatures to fall to. Origen put it this way, or seems to have put it this way, that God created a material world that, of course, includes our planet. And for Origen, living in a very heliocentric, view of the world, Earth would be probably at the bottom. You could say heliocentric, but in a sense, did I say heliocentric? That would be the sun is at the center. For Origen, the physical world is at the bottom. The sun definitely is above us, as are the stars and whatever other heavenly orbs there are. And for Origen, this world kind of represents, he understood it to be like the final safety net for falling souls. Now, we're talking about Origen for a second, right? Augustine would not have wanted to put it this way. Origen was overly determined, we think, by Platonic distrust of the body, and Gnostic ideas are not far behind. Augustine's more aware of this problem. So Augustine's trying to avoid the idea that creation, material creation, is at best sort of this necessary evil that God has created so that falling souls don't just fall forever. They land somewhere from which then they can begin, hopefully, and by the grace of God, to make their way back toward their source. But back to Augustine, you still have the problem then of why would any angelic being created by a perfect and good God rebel and fall away? Now, I used to think that I read in Suhaki, in this very book, something that apparently is not there. So now I'm either thinking I read it in some other secondary source, or else in my reading of the City of God which was decades ago in Idaho. I've never tried to return to that book. Confessions I've read many times and I love very much. The City of God, well, let's just say, as I recall, here's Augustine's solution. Solution to the problem being, how could there be a fall into sin by perfectly created spiritual beings? Well, all these angelic beings praised God, and this was their great bliss, their great happiness, their blessedness. And it was easy for them to do precisely because they experienced, in a kind of direct way, we might say, the promise of God's sustaining love and grace. There was no hint of uncertainty, no doubt, no anxiety. They were filled by the loving grace and presence of God, except for this one. And that's the problem. Augustine speculated that the one that we call Satan or Lucifer, of all the angels, did not have a direct experience of the assuring love of God, holding him in very being itself. That instead, for whatever inscrutable divine reason, this spiritual being experienced the anxiety of not being sure that he was loved and upheld by God. And out of that lack of assuredness, that lack of certainty, rebelled against God and somehow was able to convince other spiritual beings or angels also to join him in this rebellion, so that, as one of you at least speculated in your notes, Augustine believed that there was a fall prior to the fall of humanity, and that fall is, of course, led to the fall of humanity because Augustine associates the serpent, who's never identified in Genesis as anything but a creature of Yahweh, the most cunning of creatures that Yahweh had made, but nothing more than a creature. But, Augustine followed in traditions already forming that this was the satanic figure, who, having already fallen from heavenly grace, really you could say not of his own fault. So even for Augustine, as he is trying to, in a sense, protect the goodness of God against the problem of evil and sin, you can only blame it on Satan for so long before you have to ask, why would Satan have fallen? And then you get Augustine's rather uncomforting speculation that of all the angelic beings, this is the one that did not receive the assurance of the love of God. I'm not telling you this in order that you might believe it, nor am I suggesting that it's particularly good and praiseworthy theology, but it is an illustration of the kind of attempt made by one great Christian thinker to wrestle with the problem of sin and evil in a world created by a ostensibly good and loving and perfect God. And you've got to find somebody to blame. But even here, ultimately, the ultimate fault lies with God. Isn't that interesting? I think that'll bless your souls.